Always super exciting. So according to YouTube, we're live, and I know Katie will tell us if that's not really the case, which is cool. So in the words of Truman Burbank, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And thank you for joining us today. This is the first edition of the Google Cloud Platform Provider for Terraform office hours. It just rolls right off the tongue. 17-word sentences, my favorite. My name is Kareem Steerley. I'm a developer advocate at HashiCorp, more focused on Terraform. And I'm joined today by Megan Bang, Phil Sauter, Arith Sherman, and Sam Levinick. Hello all, and thank you for being here today. Always super excited. So there we go. And I know Katie will tell us. So just got my feedback that we're indeed live, which is cool. So let's do a quick round of introductions. Megan, what do you do at HashiCorp? And what does your day-to-day look like?
Hi, I'm Megan. I lead the Google Terraform provider from the HashiCorp side. My day-to-day responsibilities include working on bugs and implementing features for the provider, helping prioritize items, and communicating pertinent HashiCorp roadmap items to the team at Google.
Very, very cool. And Phil, you're next. Can you tell our viewers what you focus on at HashiCorp?
Sure. I am product manager for strategic providers at HashiCorp, which focuses, among other things, on the Google provider and Kubernetes integrations for Terraform. Day to day, I work on strategy and roadmap items for the various ecosystem providers.
Nice. Thank you. Arith, you're an engineering manager, also with a focus on strategic providers.
Yes, that's exactly right. It's good to meet you all. I work closely with Phil on setting the roadmap and setting general engineering priorities day to day and people management responsibilities. And I'm also the EM for the strategic providers team.
Thank you. And finally, Sam, you work as a software engineer at Google.
Yeah, I'm a software engineer at Google. I work on a team working on the Terraform provider from the Google side. So my day-to-day kind of looks like investigating new APIs and figuring out how to implement them as resources in Terraform.
Awesome. So as we just figured out, and hopefully some people figured out before, the Google provider is maintained, the Google provider for Terraform is maintained both by the Google Cloud Graphite team and HashiCorp. So first question for you, Sam, and also following your intro a bit, how does this collaboration work? I keep hearing about magic modules, more things. Can you expand upon that a little?
Oh yeah, for sure. So Magic Modules is a tool that my team originally created to kind of speed up the development of a lot of these Terraform resources. And how that happens is it takes a description of an API and some custom code and turns that into the actual Terraform resource. And so it allows us to make a lot of changes faster than we would normally be able to make them. So it's kind of it's supposed to be a force multiplier or some way of kind of improving the speed that we can actually develop new resources. And so Megan has been contributing to that. Yeah, so it's an awesome joint project.
Awesome, yeah. The amount of releases your team puts out is just amazing. I mean, weekly release schedule, Mondays, I believe. So with that in mind, how do you keep backwards compatibility a thing? Like, how do you make sure practitioners don't struggle when they upgrade to a newer version? Question for all of you, by the way. Whoever goes first wins. Or I'll pick.
So I guess from my side, I just try to keep it at top of mind whenever we add a new resource or add a new field, just making sure that we're not marking anything required that would break any previous existing users. So I think it's a lot of keeping the users at the forefront of our mind.
Having a good experience for users, I think, is always very, very interesting. So usually when we do office hours, we solicit feedback from the community asking for questions they have, Obviously, you can leave questions on our Discuss forum or ask them in one of our user groups, which these days are more virtual than not. So first question that we got was, this is a long one. So what is the best way of provisioning a GKE cluster and then setting things like machine types for each node and custom labels? So think about it as not the first step with GKE, but more like, what's the second step?
So this is a very specific question, about the Google resources themselves, and it'd probably be better if one of the engineers, either Megan or Sam, answered either how we could or perhaps where to find the resources to learn how to and how to open an issue if you can't find those resources.
Sure. So if you go to the terraform.io and look up the Google provider, you can find the documentation for Google Container Cluster, and that will be a good starting point for working with Kubernetes. I'm not super familiar with Kubernetes myself, but you can find the container resources there. If you have any questions, you can always ask in our GitHub repo and the issues. It would be Terraform provider Google. So that would be a good start.
Awesome. And we're going to post a link to the provider's GitHub repository in our live chat, so you don't have to remember it, which I think is always nice. Let's see what else is coming in at this point.
Oh, I have something to add on that. I would check out either the GCP Slack or the HashiCorp Slack for the Terraform for the Google Terraform provider, because a lot of times other people in the community will have great answers to this stuff when I personally don't.
Yeah, I think there's many ways to build a GKE cluster, and some of them are definitely more useful than others and more involved. That's definitely a good call out. Let's see if we can also get the link to that Slack in the live chat notes. Kind of hoping my trusty sidekick / hero Katie can help us with that. And in the meantime, let's see if we have a few more questions. And while we work on that, I think, Sam, you mentioned GitHub issues and for examples, for code examples to check out various places. As a practitioner, my first place to go for examples would always be the GitHub issue, the Terraform documentation. How would I go about getting more examples in there? And what's a good place to find more of these examples?
So are you asking for how to add new examples to the documentation?
Yeah.
Okay.
So if I, as a contributor, as a practitioner, want to become a contributor, how would I go about that?
Yeah, so so you can absolutely create a pull request onto the Terraform Google provider repository. That will trigger one of us to look at it and get it to the right place. The right place for these things usually is going to be the Magic Modules repository, actually, because that creates, it generates code that goes into both the Terraform provider Google and the Terraform provider Google beta providers. So to make sure that that example stays up to date in both of them, we would, if you made it against the provider repo, we would pull that up into Magic Modules for you, or obviously you can create a pull request into Magic Modules itself, would be the preferred route. But
so a single pull request ends up in multiple providers and in Magic Modules itself, which I think is always nice. So you mentioned the Google beta provider. Let's talk about that a little, because in this sense, Terraform, most of the other providers have a single version. What's the idea behind the beta provider?
I can take this. The nice thing, Google is, I guess the Google provider is unique that we have a separate beta provider that we maintain, and it makes it easy for us to support GCP features that are generally available and also in beta. So basically, if there's a feature you're looking for that is in either one of those categories and the REST API is available for it, we can put it in one of those providers. And if you can either contribute yourself or you can put an issue out and we can put it in there for you. So it just makes it nice that all the features are available with the provider.
I think having access to all features is definitely a great thing. So question from our community. Do you accept contributions from external users? And if so, how can I contribute to the project? We touched upon that a little, but let's say today is my first day of using Terraform and I really want to add something to the Google provider. Where would I go? And I think, Sam, you mentioned Magic Modules, obviously, but let's take a step back. Megan, where would you suggest somebody starts looking for a practitioner starts looking for information on how to contribute to a provider?
Sure. I think there's some contributing guides out on terraform.io that it kind of outlines our guidelines for contributing. And you can also look at contributing guides in the repos as well for both Magic Modules and for the provider. I believe that out on terraform.io, there's some kind of starting spots. You can always reach out and ask questions too in the Slack channels. There is, I believe it's committers Terraform that if you have a provider that you're working on, you have questions. I think that's maybe what it is for Slack, but maybe it's a different one that you can ask questions and we can always answer them. So.
Awesome, thank you. And so next question. I'm new to Terraform and exploring its usage for a project that uses Cloud Run, pops up, Cloud SQL, Cloud Memory Store. What's the support status for these features in the GCP provider and these services?
So it's a good question, and I think any individual may not know offhand, right, the support status for any individual resource in a cloud, right, because the ecosystem is huge. So what I would recommend anyone do is go to Terraform.io and look at the documentation for the specific provider. The documentation off to the side on the left-hand side will have a list of all the resources and the attributes that you can configure on those resources. And you can be assured that if it's in that provider and the provider is generally available, that it is a supported resource.
I think as a practitioner, I always love that the features are generally pretty much everywhere and pretty much everywhere rolled out in the same way. So while we wait for more community questions, this is exciting. You can't prepare for half the questions, and you never know when the interesting ones, the really hard and interesting ones come in. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about what's your preferred way. Obviously, when you start using the provider, if you use it in the Cloud Console, then you're always signed in. But say you're using the provider locally, what's a good way of getting credentials for the provider in?
So there are several different ways you can use credentials with the Google provider. The way that I personally like to do it is I create a service account for Terraform in the project that I want to use, and I actually download those credentials and reference it from a file. Like I said, there's other ways you could do it. You can do it with environmental variables and inject them that way, or statically define them. But that's the way that I've found it the easiest and the least error prone.
Removing errors from provisioning, I think, is always a good thing. It's pretty much what we all like, infrastructure as code, right? Just being able to type out everything, send in pull requests to your colleagues and getting good feedback. Yeah, so while we wait again for more questions, let's talk a little bit about what's your preferred way of building infrastructure in terms of when you use Terraform. How do you go about building it out? Do you start locally? Do you start with Terraform Cloud? What works for you?
Well, I guess when I started using Terraform, I was using it locally, so that's just kind of what I was most comfortable with. So I usually, just kind of trial and error with it locally, and then from there, I'll move it to Terraform Cloud.
Yeah, I agree with Megan. I think, almost like any software development, and infrastructure as code is definitely, sort of a niche within software development. You pretty much always start locally, right? You create a small proof of concept or a prototype, you make sure it works, and then you evolve it from there. And you may start with running everything local with local state, and then you may evolve that to running it locally with remote state, either in Terraform Cloud or some other supported backend state. And then you may go all the way into, when you merge it into your version control, then it triggers a plan within Terraform Cloud.
And just being able to get a little bit of overview of what's happening, I think that's really powerful as an infrastructure engineer or DevOps engineer, depending on what title you currently prefer. I think it's really nice to look into your pull request and see that nice little green check mark from Terraform Cloud or your GitHub Actions, whatever you have, that says, hey, this is going to work out. That promise removes a lot of stress. So we got a question from Grace. Is Terraform another form of infrastructure provisioning like AWS CloudFormation? I think that's interesting. Obviously, this is a GCP session. But I think as a general tool, I'll start by answering the first part of this, but feel free to jump in. What I see is that CloudFormation is very well usable within AWS, but it limits you to a single cloud. Terraform, on the other side, provides 125 different providers that HashiCorp supports together with our partners. So that means if you want to go multi-cloud, you still can use the same tool. Obviously brings a different language with it, HCL, or as somebody called it in our last stream, HashiCorp's form of YAML, which is one way of seeing it, yeah. But I think the power of having a tool that you can use for all your setups is, to me, a lot more useful than having a single utility. I think we talked about the GKE provider before. What's nice about that is you could use Terraform to start up your GKE, sorry, not the GKE provider, the GKE cluster resource. You could use Terraform with a Google provider to start up a GKE cluster, then use a Kubernetes provider to configure more in that, then use the Helm provider to go a few steps further, and eventually the Kubernetes operator.
Yeah, I really like that answer, Kareem. Do you mind if I expand on it a little bit?
Yes, please.
So I have seen some confusion around this, right? And not so much like the CloudFormations versus Terraform. I think that's pretty clear. They're both, different domain-specific languages or DSLs. And like you described, like CloudFormation only works in AWS and Terraform is multi-cloud. But what we mean by Terraform as multi-cloud is it presents a common workflow across all the different cloud environments. It doesn't abstract the cloud environment so that it's a common sort of resource definition across any cloud environment, because as you know, the resources, load balancers, compute instances, storage in the various cloud environments work differently across them. So what it provides is that standard workflow that you can, in Terraform using HCL, define your infrastructure in Google or other clouds in a very similar way, and you can execute them in the same way.
Yeah, I think that's just the option to have the same type of workflow everywhere just makes life so much easier. Not having to rethink, especially when you work in an enterprise context where, well, one of our partners works in 3 clouds at the same time, Kubernetes deployments everywhere. You kind of don't want to have to go through learning specific things in terms of DSLs, just so you can deal with that kind of situation. I think it removes speed from development and is a great source of introducing new errors. Thank you, Phil. So Ari, we're currently doing weekly releases, and I hear a new major release is coming up. Can you share a little bit, maybe a tiny bit of what's in store for us?
Firstly, we haven't yet started talking about what's going to be in the major release just yet. But when we do create those public milestones to show the kind of things that we're working on, and you'll be able to see it on the GitHub repository if you follow it.
Awesome. I think Megan, you mentioned there might be a release sometime later this fall. Maybe even
I don't
later,
think we have a specific date for it.
Definitely not committing to anything. I mean, it's crazy right now with whatever is going on pretty much everywhere. So I'm excited to see when it comes. And I think especially with the changes that are coming out for Terraform core, 0.13, the beta, we all had a chance to play with it yet and try out some of the new exciting things.
I haven't done too much with it. I've created some infrastructure with it, but I don't think I've tried any of the new exciting things with it yet.
So, I mean, I'm a developer advocate for Terraform, and I live and breathe Terraform. So for me, this is easy. I think the feature that's coolest is just being able to provide my own error messages for certain interactions, and just, 6 months down the road, knowing why that variable has to have that specific type of format. It's one of those features that makes you go, this should have been there from the start, but it's going to make my life easier from the day I start using it. And in a way, I think you could see that a little bit as a, whenever you build infrastructure, you're trying, hopefully, aiming to build a best practices approach, making sure, what you build right now will work 6 months down the road, will work when you move to a different team, if you move to a different team. Phil, maybe question for you. What are some of the best practices when creating and configuring GKE with Terraform? Following on our earlier question.
Yeah, sure. So, obviously best practices are generally going to depend on, what type of sort of environment you're working in, what type of company you're working in, size of team that you're working on. It may differ if you're an individual DevOps engineer versus, on a team of DevOps engineers or SREs. But generally, I would say it's common when you start creating Terraform configurations to put everything into one, main.tf, and you would define your GKE cluster, and then you may, in the same configuration, jump into the Kubernetes provider and start configuring Kubernetes inside the GKE cluster. And I think most people will find as they mature, as they use Terraform more and more, and that configuration starts to grow, that it becomes much easier to manage if you break the individual components out into modules. And these modules could be modules that you have created for your organization, or that you are consuming that perhaps Google has created. Google has created modules, for example, for GKE. And then you may create a module for your Kubernetes configuration on top of that you leverage, and that other people can leverage as well. And that's sort of the beauty of modules. So this sort of composable model using modules with Terraform, I would consider a best practice. Some other best practices, generally speaking, with Terraform, I would recommend not trying to manage the default resources that are created with a GKE cluster. You'll find this to be quite difficult and frustrating. Instead, create create resources with your intent, right? So if you need to use a service account, create a service account. Don't try to leverage the default service account. And I think you'll have a much easier time with that sort of model than trying to use the default resources.
Thanks. I think
I'd also like to if you Google for Terraform recommended practices, we have a nice guide for transitioning from the individual level of usage of Terraform to enterprise level usage. And so there's a full-fledged guide looking at your workflow, talking about the different stages between manual to automated in your infrastructure as code practice. So you might find value there.
Awesome. We'll see if we can get that link up in the chat. In the meantime, quick shout out to our Learn team on learn.hashicorp.com. There's plenty of guides there for all the providers, for all of our tools, which I think is super beautiful. And we have our next question. So this is going super well. Thank you all, by the way, for joining us for this inaugural session. Not just my panelists, all of you, but also our viewers. It's exciting, and it provides a way as a community to get together a little bit. So for our next question, what are your thoughts on automated testing of Terraform? Things like Jenkins workflows that include testing PRs, so pull requests on the code with tests before merging the PR. And so the way I read this question is on the Terraform resources, not on the Terraform provider code base, which would be in Go.
So are you talking, you think it's specifically about testing like changes in a config between two versions, something like that?
Yeah, I think the way Michael describes this and the way I understand it is how would you use Terraform in a CI/CD workflow and making sure code is okay before merging it?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of different things to look at here when you're testing Terraform. One thing that I would call out probably is that the Terraform language server includes a validate feature, which will ensure that your code is actually correct, that there's no syntax errors and things like that. That is one way you could test it. The plan itself, I think of as a form of testing. Because it will tell you the changes that will be made, and it'll also tell you whether or not your code will work when you run a Terraform plan.
I think the language server definitely deserves a shout out, especially since we just released the Visual Studio code extension, which has been a pleasure to work with. Just having an editor that thinks a little bit with you, I think is pretty nice. And I just realized that something we didn't fully mention is pre-commit hooks, either locally or through GitHub Actions. Have your code run through Terraform Validate and Terraform FMT, which you might know from Go. You get canonical rewriting of your code base, making sure we all use the same style, so there's never any discussion on if tabs or spaces are the correct approach. I think that's definitely a great start, because I know half the time something happens that makes my code not as great as it should be. But that's only, I think that's only the first step. Just continuing to expand upon that question a little bit, and what Phil said, building modules, definitely a great approach, but it's more than just your Terraform code, right? You can test the Terraform code all you want, but if there's no README in there, your code shouldn't be considered final, I think. Obviously a very opinionated approach, but the last few teams I worked with, we all would reject code that didn't include a README, included a README that had all the Terraform variables in there. And I think that's one thing I love about the Terraform community. We have a lot of the same problems. We want to build modules. We don't want to type README, MD tables, markdown tables manually. So with tools like Terraform Docs, you can actually generate documentation from your modules with a single command line comment. And I think that, like, I think Sam used a beautiful word for this. It's a force multiplier, especially in a bigger team when you're building a lot of modules. definitely helps to have all your stuff generated.
Something else I'll add, Kareem, it's actually only available in Terraform Cloud, but if you are looking for the type of testing that is ensuring that you're not breaking sort of a policy within your environment, right? So you're only deploying to a specific region, or you're only just deploying a specific instance type or an instance class, then in Terraform Cloud, there's a tool called Sentinel that can do this for you as well, and that could be a form of testing.
Sentinel is definitely something we should talk more about as a company and just show people how useful it really is, especially because it's also HCL. So if you know how to write Terraform code, writing Sentinel policies isn't all that far off.
Yeah, and in fact, if you're using Terraform Cloud, when you can use the feature called speculative plans, where you can essentially test run your changes against the Sentinel policies to see whether they meet your requirements. In general, we recommend a manual review of your plan to ensure that nothing untoward is going to happen when you apply that plan.
Yeah, those discussions of starting 100 instances rather than 10. Yeah, I would love to say I've never been there. I think one thing that could definitely help with that is what Travis is suggesting. And so Travis's question is, are there resources for providing a GUI for management that allows a practitioner to select provider resources and then outputting the actual HCL, the Terraform code for this?
I think there are some third-party tools that will generate a GUI representation of your Terraform state once you have it. But as far as I know, there aren't these sorts of tools necessarily to allow you to kind of use a wizard to build out your Terraform configuration essentially.
Yeah, it would be nice to just provide my Google credentials, my JSON file, and go like, hey, give me everything. I know Terraformer does that, like you mentioned, Arith. And it's hard, right? Like there is no easy way to scour your account and just say, these 10 items all have the same type of variable, all have the same type of content, so let's turn that into a variable. Maybe one day we'll have a solution for that. I'd be excited about that. Just a GUI, click together my infrastructure, copy paste, and then have it work. Would make infrastructure as code definitely a lot more approachable than it already is. So while we wait for folks to give us a couple more questions, let's talk favorite resources. I know if you're working on code, you always have something that you're really proud of. So Sam, what's your favorite Google provider resource?
Yeah, I would have to say not just a single resource, but it's kind of a collection of very similar ones, but the IAM resources. So all of the IAM that on GCP is pretty much backed by the same structure. And so what was pretty cool for me when I was working on adding a bunch of new IAM resources is that a lot of it could be just totally shared between all of them. And it made my job a lot easier. And so that's what I liked about it. And now we have through Magic Modules, a way to generate these resources, and it's super, super quick. And that's what I like about it.
Very nice. Yeah, I can see how things that work very closely together and are very similar in structure would definitely make for a pleasurable experience in terms of coding it. Megan, how about you?
I guess maybe the secret manager, just because that was probably the first resource that I worked on, where I was able to do multiple resources for it. And I don't know, it was a good learning experience for me. So I feel like I'm a little partial to it. So.
Also, one of the more involved ones to jump into. So, Arith, you're next.
I'm rather than a specific resource, I'd say I'm partial to the GKE feature because I also work on the Kubernetes side of the strategic providers. So I have I have a penchant for that.
Yeah, I've definitely used the cluster resource a lot. There's so much more that goes into it than just a single cluster resource. And like you said, Phil, if you need a service account, create a service account. Don't try to be smart and reuse the ones that are there. I've been bitten by that. Phil, what's yours?
Yeah, I mean, Arith stole my thunder. I think it's pretty obvious, right? I like the GKE resources. One of the things I really like about them, though, is that it's really easy to get up and running and to get started, right? You can actually create a GKE cluster with fairly minimal config, and from there you can get very, very fine grained and making changes to it so it fits your exact need. So I really like that it allows you to spin up Kubernetes in a really simple and easy way. But then the sort of composability or the customization that it allows is fantastic.
Nice. I think that's the power of Terraform. Like, start out with a very simple example and then add the features that you need and evolve along the way. In the meantime, let's say I'm not the only one coding anymore. Mark has a beautiful question about that. How does Terraform handle state file locking? So for example, I'm an engineer on this project and another engineer is joining. And let's say we have a local Terraform run. How do we make sure this doesn't become a problem for both of us?
Essentially, this is a feature that you're going to be looking for in your Terraform backend, whatever backend you choose to use. State locking is offered by Terraform, so you ensure that only one write is occurring at a time. You can find out more on the Terraform documentation. If you Google state locking, it talks about the backend types that tell you whether a backend supports locking or not. It talks about how you can force unlock the state if you truly feel that you need to. And so there's quite a bit of information up there, but we do support that since it's definitely something enterprise users run into.
Nice. And so another question which actually builds on that. So we have the new practitioner that just joined and they have mistakenly done a Terraform apply which updated the state file. What's the best possible way to undo the change we just made and go back to our previous infrastructure?
Maybe one best practice that we haven't mentioned so far is tracking your Terraform configuration in Git. So ideally, you will have a pull request that was merged that changed your configuration before that apply. And then it's just a simple matter of rolling back the commit and doing another apply. But otherwise, it might be a bit difficult.
Yeah, I think you can definitely Terraform apply or destroy a change and undo as it is. But obviously, if you started up 100 instances, I think bears repeating. Your cloud provider is definitely going to charge you for that. So I think if you're getting started with Terraform, one of the providers that I like to show people a lot for our workshops is the Docker provider, because you can do everything locally. You can get used to the language. You can do all the applies. Plus, it's super, super fast. GKE cluster takes a little while to start up for obvious reasons, because slightly more than a storage location. It's a couple different VMs in different regions, depending on how you set it up, of course. But before we can get there, we're back to our service account question. And Sharkeys, I think, has an interesting one around that. What's a recommended way to create a service account for an organization that has all the rights needed to create new projects and have the rights on those projects? This is, I guess, the origin code of your infrastructure repository. This might be a hard one because Well,
Yeah,
Sam,
I think
I'm hoping you have an idea.
I've done this a couple times. I think it was as easy as creating a service account and then assigning it org level permissions. And I think that was done through either an organization IAM policy, or I might have done it through the console. But there are certain permissions that you can grant to a service account that'll allow it like to project creator. And then I believe for any project that a service account actually creates, it'll own that account from then on.
Yeah, I think with all providers, the only problem is creating your initial state and having that shared in a bucket, because you kind of have the problem of you first need a service account or an account anyway, and then you can create the bucket, but you need the bucket to have your state, which is also exciting, you know, have your first review be in person when that's possible again, and then push it to a remote state backend.
Yeah, I just
So
want to add that, you know, Terraform will, you know, there is that state inception sort of dance that we have to do when you're starting out. And I think everyone that's used Terraform for a while is well aware of that, but Terraform does take care of that for you, right? So if you start with your local state and then you change your backend to a remote backend and then you do Terraform init, it will migrate the state for you. So it is, as long as you are aware of that workflow, it is fairly painless once you do it.
I think state inception is a beautiful word. I feel like 2015, 2016 me would love to have that as a t-shirt, because the amount of discussions we had around that at the office, working out protocols on how new projects should be started, because everything is a separate project, right? You don't want to share state. I think, Phil, you mentioned it beautifully. You start out with a single main.tf, which has all your 372 resources in there, and then you realize that, hey, maybe they're not that different at all. Maybe we should be using modules for that. So when you're building your infrastructure, no matter if you have one resource or 100 or maybe 100,000, what's a good way of debugging your Terraform code and seeing the logs and maybe even sharing those logs with a team? And is that needed?
Yeah, I can jump in here. As far as log sharing goes, I think that you could use whatever tool that you prefer right now to inspect the logs and to share logs within your team, whether that's Datadog or someone else. Terraform outputs logs in the same way that most other tools do. In terms of debugging, that's a really good question. Outside of inspecting the plan changes, there are several third-party tools like Kitchen Test or TerraTest that let you do that sort of integration test to inspect whether Terraform is doing what you want. I think it's about finding the balance between trusting Terraform to do the right thing and investing in writing these integration level tests, because that is going to be a significant investment that you're going to have to put in to make sure that your tests are up to date when you make changes to your Terraform code and so on. So at least from my perspective, the plans aren't typically the plans are a good way to look at diffs in your Terraform configuration and to evaluate what's going wrong. If you're debugging some sort of issue with Terraform itself, where Terraform's not doing what you expect, we have a few different levels of debugging for the logs. You can Google that. It's on terraform.io. We have log levels like warning, debug, and trace that will give you a bit more information about what's happening. And if you do have an issue that you're not able to solve, you can create an issue on our GitHub repository with the trace, and we'll be able to help you out.
I think whenever you encounter one of those, thank you, Arif, in your console or in your terminal or wherever you run Terraform, Terraform usually has this, pretty much like full screen ASCII art saying, hey, something went wrong, please ship your logs to the provider and drop them on GitHub. Scary as it is, there's real people working on that. So Megan, maybe you can explain what happens when I share those logs with HashiCorp on the GitHub issue.
Sure. So when you submit a bug, we'll just, a lot of times it's really helpful to see the debug log just to see that we know exactly what your setup is and that we can recreate it. And as we recreate it, I think we each have our own way to debug the code locally. And so if we can recreate it exactly how you have it and reproduce the bug, it just really helps us to make sure that we're solving the bug that you're actually looking for.
I think that certainly helps. Let's imagine my company is not able to share logs publicly. What would be a good way of getting support for that without, posting my TF files to GitHub and sharing my logs, which might contain, well, secret data that I can't really sanitize without making the logs unusable? Do practitioners have an email address they can reach out to, or is there some other way that we can support them?
You might need a support plan for that. If you wanted to share logs privately, I would recommend, sanitizing it as best as you can, or just, I guess, throwing in a fake config of what you think might be happening, just so that we can try and reproduce it as best as possible.
And if they do allow you to share a PGP encrypted version, we do have a key on Keybase that you could use to encrypt your logs if you so chose.
I think that's always a nice way, just making sure the right people can see your code, but not everyone else. So while we wait for more questions, this has been fun so far, like 45 minutes in. I think we're able to answer quite a few interesting questions so far. Yeah, what are you excited about for next week? For those just joining us, or for those who don't know, we've got HashiConf coming up, 3 days of, well, virtual events, workshops and everything. Are you all attending sessions, giving a workshop?
So I had the opportunity to do one of the beta workshops, and I'm super excited about it. It's infrastructure pipelines with Terraform Cloud using run triggers. And I think that is just a cool topic in general, but it's also a really cool execution on the Terraform Cloud side. I was super thrilled to see that.
I think workshops definitely are going to be interesting, especially, like you said, I've also had the chance to be in one, and our Learn team has been building some interesting stuff that makes it easy to follow along. And I think best of all, you get to play with the code afterwards. I don't know if that holds true for all of them. Should probably not say that, but for the ones we tested, it definitely is there, and I think that's nice. And then there's going to be a couple of interesting announcements. It should make for an interesting first fully virtual multi-day experience. And if you happen to be on our YouTube chat right now, I think you might enjoy going to our HashiConf next week. It's free. Sign up, like so many thousand other people have done, and meet your fellow practitioners from around the world. I think that despite not being able to be in the same physical space, all of us just being together in the same forum, whichever form that is, be it video like us right now, or, well, maybe just via text, is definitely powerful. We just did an AWS workshop together with some folks from Google, who did obviously a Google workshop for a hackathon. A hackathon itself would have been a small local event, 20 students. We ended up having people from 20, 25 countries, and 400 people that signed up. And I think we're all making, an interesting thing out of this situation. So much for virtual events. And I think what I'm seeing in our chat is we're giving answers that are helpful to people. So that's definitely a good thing. Yeah, I think, Arith, you mentioned Datadog as one of the options. We should probably mention that there's a provider for that. So you can Terraform everything literally from step 0 to step 100. And if
Yeah,
not,
that's a good idea. I didn't even think about that.
It's just the beauty of having access to codified infrastructure.
Yeah, I think there's even a famous or perhaps even infamous example now of terraforming ordering a pizza. So, you know, even outside of infrastructure, right? You can do a lot.
Well, first of all, pizza is definitely part of the infrastructure. I've not
Fair.
been to a single hacking event where there wasn't a lot of pizza. The provider you're talking about is the Domino's provider, if I'm not entirely mistaken. And yeah, to my dismay, that one only works in the US, despite us having, I should mention, I'm in the Netherlands right now, so we do have Domino's here, but ours doesn't have an API that we can use. So sadly, I still have to order my pizza through a web interface. It's the Stone Age, I'll tell you. But yes, pizza, Datadog, Google, yeah, it's all there.
What more could you want?
Yeah. So let's see if we have any more questions. Because if not, I'm going to throw y'all a curveball. I'm going to ask for your biggest mess up with infrastructure. Because we all have been there. Sam, I see you have an idea and a pain to share.
Yeah. So most of my experience with using Terraform and the Google provider and provisioning infrastructure has been through testing as I'm working on these resources. And you know, when you're just starting to write a new resource and things aren't quite working the way you would want them to, sometimes resources get orphaned and just end up existing in the cloud, and you lose track of them. And I've definitely had a couple of resources that I've been working on, and I've gone and looked later at my cloud console or something like that, and found like hundreds of resources, just like the list going off the page, and I have to go through and like click and try and delete them all. So it's been some good times.
Well,
I was going to say that's the exact same thing with me. As a lot of times it's like they get orphaned and you have to go back in there, and then you spend like an hour or so just trying to clean up the mess you made.
so what you're saying is that our community has an opportunity to build a Reaper program that just takes whatever is not in your state and cleans it up.
Yeah, there you go.
Nice. I think that that would make definitely for an interesting presentation for HashiConf US. The cleaner/Reaper process. Let's see what else we can answer, because I think we have time for one or two more questions. Though I do feel that Phil has been awfully quiet with regards to war stories. And I feel like there's something there that you just don't want to share because we don't want to harm any enterprises, but we don't have to name them.
Yeah, I was a systems engineer at a national service provider a while back, earlier in my career, and I may have taken down an entire region by myself during a small mistake that I made during an upgrade process. Definitely could have used some Terraform in that scenario, actually.
Taken down, or made a good point for having a disaster recovery approach in effect. I think two sides of the same coin.
I did actually end up going on to develop a disaster recovery as a service offering for that service provider. Maybe that was the impetus.
Scratch your own itch, right? And solve problems that you have, because you know that other people will have those problems as well.
Or problems I created for other people, you know.
Thank you for your service. I think solving other people's problems by solving your own problems without going into the physical and mental well-being realm, but bringing it back to Terraform modules, I think is really a good way of writing good Terraform code. Because when you think about a module and publishing it on the Terraform registry, you can get feedback from the community. Other people will start using it and point out cases that you might not be running into, cases that your current code might not be breaking on, but maybe you run into something. I just had a module that uses DNS setup, and for me, one of the things that I did was append 2 strings for a text record when I should be using them as a list. And I had a user reach out to me and explain to me why this was a problem, because they use that module for 5 different domains. I think that kind of feedback is very powerful. Also, I can feel that user's frustration. I'm not naming any names, but thank you so much for emailing me and letting me fix that. Because some company's email system was briefly unreachable because their text records were not properly set up. Text and MX records, I should say. Testing is important. So let's see. We have a couple more people in the chat. I can see Jackie definitely likes our pizza provider. I can see that. But no more questions, which is great, because we're nearly at the end of our hour. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today, both in the chat and all of you, Sam, Arif, Megan, Phil, thank you. And I'm looking forward to doing our next session, probably after HashiConf, talking a little bit about the new things that are coming out. By that time, we'll have a few more releases for the Google provider.